Hey y'all, I keep getting questions from people about what variant is best with SNS, and truly right now there is no particular variant that I think is best in class as it was before. Before it was very obvious that VG kind of outclassed everything else because it would give stamina or SNS, and that would basically mean that you would never be able to have to drop shield. But this is going to be like kind of an exercise in going through everything here, rating SNS in terms of like what people usually value SNS for, which in terms of like why SNS is important as a base, SNS can basically increase your clump survivability by almost 75% or a little bit more than 75%, which is why it's just being run kind of overall in general right now. And even from a kill squad perspective, it's being considered just because the weekend on SNS is so good and it's such a big radius. And it just kind of enables your army to do a lot more than otherwise would be able to. But hopping right into this Ice Gauntlet in particular, rankings I have down here at the bottom in terms of like what I am actually kind of going off of here. So like in the clump, if you're not gonna die, you're gonna be rated very highly. If you're leaving the clump, if you can't die, you're gonna be rated very highly. Debuffs, but Void Gauntlet's in the class of its own. Nothing's really gonna compete with that. And then there's stuff like space control. And living is like your primary projective objective as SNS because when you live, you provide all your buffs. And even though you have 500 con, it's very easy to get blown up by large detonate pushes, which are very, very common on B gate in particular. But there are other aspects that are really important as well. Like debuffs are very, very important, and space control is also very important because the more space you control, the less those clumps will be able to hit you, and like their timing will be a little bit off, and then that will help you live because you die to people using cooldowns at the same time, not necessarily over time with SNS. So that's where space control can really help. Debuffs just help you live, help your army uh, kill people. This is stuff like weaken, rend, disease. Leaving the clump, that's just basically your ability to escape a clump if you need be. So if there's a 10-man detonate push and I call it a declump, if I have a thing like a Void Gauntlet, there is no way I'm leaving that clump. If I have Ice Gauntlet, I'm probably not going to be able to leave that clump. But some other builds like Greatsword are going to be able to leave that clump, and that's what this category kind of covers. And an in clump is just survivability. In clumps, this is stuff that will give you stand back very, very quickly, like Spear and Greatsword. And it's also stuff that will just help you survive giant clump crashes in general, which is something like Ice Gauntlet. So hopping right into this, Ice Gauntlet, I already talked about this, but in clump, you are not going to die with Ice Gauntlet. It's like almost impossible. The main reason why it's almost impossible as Ice Gauntlet to die in a clump, and this is a sample tree that I would recommend for Ice Gauntlet. You go Pylon just particularly for the ult charge, but the Entomb from this, it works off your player's max HP. So if I have 20k max HP, my tomb is going to have 15k effective or 15k HP. So it's just going to be basically an extra life at that point, and it's just insanely hard to break through that. The downside of this is when you go into tomb, people around you can die, but if you tell people to declump and they actually get out of the way, then you're in a spot where you're okay going into tomb. You don't have to sacrifice yourself in order to keep the people alive who are just being stupid and are staying clumped on you, and then you kind of come out of the tomb and you just go from there. And that's where Ice Gauntlet really separates itself, is that in clump value. In terms of leaving clump, Ice Gauntlet isn't particularly that good at this. It's okay. You can do like a break your ice tomb, do a sidestep into a shower, and that can like kind of help you, but it won't really help you leave the clump. Honestly, I'd probably rate this a one. Originally had it as a two, but that's just not very effective anymore because you just get pulled back in by so many different things. You're not going to leave the clump with this, but you can get value off of this. And in terms of these rankings as a whole, even though it's gonna end up with like a number, and this is gonna be it's gonna look either green or red depending on how big of a number that is. It's not necessarily something that you should read into because everything has its strength and weakness on this. There is no more best class thing. Ice Gauntlet and Void Gauntlet tend to be very, very good in very stacked group fight choke situations. Stuff like Greataxe and Greatsword are kind of more hybrid oriented stuff where they kind of work in multiple setups, but they aren't particularly the best at one particular setup. Spear is something that's just kind of useful offensively. Warhammer is kind of useful to control space, but not other than that. And then most of these other builds at the end are fun slash kind of theory crafted oriented builds. So, anyways, hopping back into IG, your debuffs on IG itself are not very good. Like, if I were just to rate the IG debuffs, I would basically rate it a 1. But because IG is the best class of building ult charge in the game, I have to bump that up by 2, just because your ult will be able to gen you a lot. of actual debuffs itself, and those ults usually have the access to the best util in the game. And then space control, nothing really compares with IG in terms of space control. It's just simply the best. Uh, Void Gauntlet, starting with the obvious buffs, debuffs on Void Gauntlet, nothing compares to it. It is just by far the best thing. In terms of space control, Void Gauntlet is okay at it, but I wouldn't say it's particularly good. I'd give it like a solid like 1.5 out of 5. It's not bad, but it's just not very useful at that in particular. In terms of leaving Clump with Void Gauntlet, good luck, that's not happening. In terms of survivability in Clump, this went from a 5 to basically a I'd argue like maybe a 1 because Scream's kind of useful in a single patch. So in something where a Void Gauntlet you can just play in this clump before, you didn't really have to ignore these other things. I don't think it really has it anymore, and if someone is running Void Gauntlet, it's basically just telling you as an either a attacker or defender perspective that if I actually swing on this guy and break his shield, he is not going to live. And that's just something I don't think a lot of people realize right now is SNS, it is very, very tanky, but when you compare like 20k HP to something like a heavy Greatsword Warhammer that has like 16k HP, it's not that much of a difference in terms of actual HP itself. You see those Greatswords dying now with the Fortify change, you will still see SNS dying, but the thing with SNS is it's very, very tanky as long as it has access to the old Fortify, which it will have until the shield breaks. So as long as you're able to break the shield stam, then SNS is going to feel a lot weaker, which is why something like Greatsword in particular is really, really interesting, because in the clump with the Greatsword build, let me go into Void Gauntlet real quick. This is just a sample tree. I go Glimpse because it could do double Oblivion. It's kind of nice. But Greatsword, with Steadfast Strike, you're able to get your stand back to full right away, which is really, really useful. Roaring Rupture is a easy way to get your stand back. Also, the Weaken's very good util. Also find the push and pull aspect of it to be weirdly effective now. There was a long time where this didn't feel like it did anything, and it kind of no-regged a lot. I've started using it more and more, and it starts to feel a lot better than it did in the past. You're able to consistently get 3 to 5 man pulls for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why that changed. I don't think people really dropped having grit or anything like that. It just inherently feels a little bit better with the current meta for some reason. And then Relentless Rush is just an easy way out of clumps. These last three passives are kind of preference. You can kind of go wherever. This will actually increase your damage to in Vig, so maybe you go something like this. You want to be really defensive, but you're not really going to be blocking with SNS. But the main util of SNS is that you can get your stand back very, very quickly. The weaken is good because it's a unique weaken that won't overlap with anything else, also lasts a long period of time. And Relentless Rush is just a get out of jail free card from any single clump, which is why in clump and out of clump, you have to rate Greatsword very, very high. I think in terms of leaving clump, it is the best. In terms about being in a clump, I think it's really good because it gets your full bar back, and it's not a very long animation, which is what makes it stand out and why I have to rate it so highly in the clump. In terms of debuffs that you provide decent debuffs in terms of your weekend because it is a unique weekend, but that is basically it. So I'll give it like a 1.5. It's okay, but it's not that great debuffs. And this is the main reason why I consider a Greatsword outside of Choke, because or outside of Fort, because it's just really, really good at living in those spots. It's hard to live with other builds. And then in terms of space control, not a lot competes with the Greatsword. It's just very, very good in terms of pressuring, controlling space. People don't really want to play by you because you have all those big zoning tools. So you have to like rate it very, very highly in terms of that. Greataxe, the main appeal of going for Greataxe with SNS is people are naturally going to be grouped up on you. It's a very easy to land and free Maelstrom. This last slot with Whirlwind I think is preference. I've had success with Reap in the past. Charge feels pretty good in OPR. Whirlwind just seems like a default like pretty good thing because you're basically built like a heavy bruiser, but with a little bit of like more tankiness and less damage. I think from my testing overall, I think Reap feels generally the best because you could throw grav, you could reap someone so that they can't get away, and then you can combo that into a maelstrom, and it's like very, very hard to deal with. It's also a very easy way to just annoy IGVGs in general because it could just pull them back in with reap, and you don't necessarily need to run reap because if you run SNS with leaping strikes, you have a way out. If you run SNS with defender's resolve, you probably don't want to run reap. You probably want a way out with your greatsword at that point. But if you run a more offensive setup with leaping strikes, I think it works very, very well, and you can kind of stagger chain people and combo them to death. The main thing you have to look out here, though, for is for Enfeebling Maelstrom with the actual Great Axe itself. it only applies on the second hit. It doesn't apply on the first hit. So it's like something that this is basically the best source of weaken in terms of a clump fight, but it is like very, very inconsistent to land versus SNS is basically a guaranteed weaken to land because it's very easy to land shield rush once you get used to the animation. So in terms about living in the clump, I don't think Great Axe helps you a lot just because the Maelstrom can be dodged. It's good, but it's not super consistent. Also, there's a lot of other Maelstroms that are around you typically if you're playing it with this build, so I don't think it helps you a ton in terms of a meta comp, but alone I will bump it up to a 3 and I'll just do this rating off of being alone. But if you're in an army itself, I'd bump this down a little bit. In terms of leaving the clump with the Great Axe, it is really, really good at leaving the clump depending on how you build it. I think if you play the spec for it to leave the clump like a whirlwind oriented setup, it's really easily up there with the top. I would say it's like a solid 4, maybe 4.5 even. I'll probably stick with 4. I'm trying to not use as many half points as I can get away with. In terms of debuffs, Enfeebling Maelstrom is the best source of weaken in the game. It is a rather short range, but it is really, really good if you can land it. I'll give this like a solid 3.5, and I'm already breaking my rule of using half points. In terms of space control, you would think this would be a really good space control oriented build. In practice, it feels like you can't be on the build as much. I've seen some people with this setup cut Whirlwind, try to take a lot of the passives out of the right side, and then even go left tree for Bloodlust just because they're not consistently getting Mauler's Fury with this. I think it's mostly an OPR oriented setup, but space control with this build is very, very solid. Like, I'd say it's a 4.5. It's up there, but it's not as good as IG, but it's very, very good. Great Axe in general, I think theoretically is very, very strong. It's just no one has quite figured out the playstyle of how to play it, and it is something I could see people easily transitioning to and having a very large impact. Spear, in the clump with Spear, you have access to some really good util with Cyclone. Some people will go Coup de Grace and then they'll use some of these heavy attack things in order to get value out of your heavy attacks, but from a main hand SNS perspective, I think that feels a little cumbersome. I think the spot where Spear is really interesting with SNS is people don't like to shoot SNSs, but they like to shoot Spears in terms of bows and fire staff. So if you offhand SNS, I think that's where it's most powerful. That being said, about surviving in the clump, you can gain stam very, very quickly with Cyclone. It's a very good source of that. The problem is it's a very long animation and you'll lose most of your HP when you go for that in the giant clump. So I still, even though it is very, very good, I have to take it down a notch, even though this should be like a 4 or 4.5. I have to take it down because it's just a long animation and it's very hard to live in that aspect. In terms of leaving clump, you have decent ability to actually get out of clump with skewer. Some people like to go perforate too. I just don't like perforate because it locks in a very long animation and it's more single targeted, and the rend isn't as useful anymore. The perforate is like the weaken itself is very, very strong, but it's more of a single target debuff than an AoE debuff, and if you're playing this with SNS, you're going to be mostly looking for AoEs. So I don't think it's very good in terms of that. So in terms of like on a debuff scale, even though it has access to some of the best debuffs in the game, I'm still going to rate it a 2 on a debuff scale. But in terms of space control, I think this is also a 5. It's like very, very high up there because Sweep is just so good at zoning people alone, and it has an extremely low cooldown. I think this is the best knockdown in the game single-handedly, even though it doesn't work versus targets with grit. But no knockdown works versus targets with grit, and knockdowns are nice because they're not affected by freedom, which has been really, really prevalent lately. So Spear, theoretically, I think is one of those that's like super, super strong. I would not say it's something I would tend to want to run in a gate fight, but if you get past the gate and get on healers, that's where Spear really shines. I think it's more of a secondary SNS or kind of like a main hand spear. You have the SNS to get out slash apply weaken and slow to people. You're not looking to play this as a traditional, hey, I'm going to block all the time with SNS. You're looking to main hand the spear and swap the SNS when you need. In terms of Warhammer, let's go right to left this time. Space control in a Warhammer, top of the notch. I think it can whiff sometimes, and that's a little sketchy, but it is in general, there's nothing that competes with the Warhammer in terms of that. In terms of debuffs, it's not bad. I wouldn't say it's great. The Path of Destiny is actually weirdly good as a debuff tool now. If I go to Warhammer tree, I don't think I have Path of Destiny on this one. This is like an armor breaker one from a while ago. But Path of Destiny is a really good source of actually applying a lot of debuffs due to Aftershock and like some of the other passives that are on this right tree. So I'd say debuffs overall, it's like it's pretty good. It's not the top of the notch, but it's like pretty good. In terms of leaving clump, that's not happening with the Warhammer. You're committed to being in the clump. In terms of survivability in the clump, I think it's fairly high. I don't think it's as high as IG, but I think it's like very high and competes with other stuff like Greatsword, which is interesting because Greatsword's only source of like clump util is basically getting that stand back, but because that animation is so short, it can help you live a lot. Warhammer, you're looking to be on the Warhammer. You're not going to help your clump survive, though. You're going to drop your actual util for your SNS in order for your personal survivability. So you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. But it's still like a theoretically a fairly good weapon. Fire staff, this is mostly in here because I've seen some people run it in OPR with decent success. I think the main thing at fire staff is good with is space control. Weirdly, your debuffs are okay. The space control aspect is just because Flamethrower actually does a surprisingly good amount of damage even in heavy for some reason. I think it's mostly just because Fire Staff is overtuned that this starts to feel good. Leaving Clump, I'll give you a 1 because you have Burnout, but you're not really going to leave the Clump and it's not going to help you in the Clump. So Fire Staff is like a fun OPR build. I wouldn't really rate it higher than that. Blunderbuss, in terms of survivability in the Clump, the new Fortify change makes it so Blunderbuss is a lot less tanky. I suspect in an up-and-coming patch this is going to get buffed, and it's going to be very, very strong again, because they've already alluded to that with changes, and I've talked about that in other videos. But for now, in the clump, you can't rate it that good or that highly. It's not awful. It's better than some other weapons, like it's better than VG, but it's not on the scale of survivability in the clump as it once was. In terms of leaving the clump, it's good at leaving the clump, but the problem with SNS is you're going to be positioned in the center of the clump, so Nutshot isn't really going to help you leave the clump very much. It's just going to kind of keep you in place for the most part. You occasionally will be able to leave the clump, but I wouldn't say it's consistent. If you're playing on the edge of the clump, this would be an easy 5, but because you're not going to be on the edge of the clump and you're probably going to be in the center, I'm going to dock it by almost half its points. In terms of debuffs, I think this is actually as good debuff util as VG now, because you will get your ult charge very, very quickly. The AoE disease feels relatively impactful now. VG Scream and Orb don't feel as impactful as people thought they were. The actual haste itself, I don't think is that bad either on Blast Shot, which most people run when they go a heavy tree. Your damage isn't that high when you go this oriented tree, but you have a lot of util, and then Exhaustive Net Shot is like basically the most oppressive ability in the game in a 1v1. So you have to rate it very highly. There's a reason why Exhaustive Net Shot and Apparatus are banned in most dual tourneys. And then in terms of space control, mostly because of that exhaustive net shot, I have to rate that very, very highly. It's just very, very good in that aspect. But the problem with BB that you'll have is your survivability is down, but your debumps and your space control is really interesting. Some people have talked about thinking about running BB over VG now, and I think that makes a decent amount of sense because VG just doesn't do everything anymore. It does everything kind of at an okay level, but it's not very impactful or as scary as a lot of people originally thought. Hatchet, this is probably the shortest term, one of the best options in the game when this worked off of your max HP. Now it's off base HP, so you're not really going to be living with Defy Death anymore. The main util of Hatchet is Berserk as a get out of jail free card, but you don't really need that anymore because you have passive freedom. Social distancing is a really good way out. Infected throw is a really good disease, a good weaken. Mostly for the infected throw, you have to rate the debuffs really high. Space control, this is not going to help you control space. Leaving clump, it's actually pretty good at leaving the clump compared to some of these other builds. I'll dock it a little bit because you're going to be in the clump, so it's not as consistent to get out as it once was, but it's pretty good. And then survivability in the clump. On the PTR, this went from I would rate it like a 4 before because you could still be affected by disease when you got that half HP bonus to I would say like a kind of a 1.5 area. So it's not bad, but I wouldn't say it's insanely good. So this is kind of what we came up with from going through this exercise. I wouldn't take everything here as gospel. You have to think of everything in terms of your what you really want to play it for. So VG, this is a good fort setup. Particularly on defense, that's his main spot where VG shines right now. V and IG also shine in Fort. Greatsword, I think, can be played in Fort. It's more of I would argue it's like kind of a hybrid setup where you can play offensively in the Fort and get success, but defensively it's not as good. And then outside, it's just very, very strong overall. I think Greatsword is like the best way to personally survive, but it's like harder to provide value in a very big 50v50 environment unless you go for aggro pulls and play sort of as a pseudo heavy melee, which inherently kind of makes it more of a hybrid role and it's kind of harder to judge. Greataxe, I would also argue, is a hybrid rule, and these hybrid rules tend to be a little bit better outside of Fort. Spear is a more offensive, I would say, weapon. If we're looking to put pressure on healers, you're maybe sweeping the other SNS, you're kind of toying with people and annoying people. It's a really good way to tilt people if you're going Spear, but I would say, in general, these weapons, I would prioritize playing on the outside of Fort. I don't think Spear or Greatsword are bad inside of Fort, but I think VG and IG tend to do a little bit better. Warhammer, I think this is more of a Fort-oriented setup. Explicitly, if you are playing in the B choke, that is the main spot where Warhammer shines. Firestaff, I'm gonna just put OPR 3v3 on there because you don't really want to play this anywhere. BB, I think, is really interesting and could be played everywhere potentially because it's just really good outside with the exhaustive net shot. It's really good inside because the nades, the plague splitting grenades. That being said, if you already have BBs on your B team, do you really want to overlap that util with the plague splitting grenades? I'm not sure. That's where you have to look at other builds. Hatchet, I think, is something that could be interesting in 4 in particular, just for the cloud, but I wouldn't really consider anywhere else. The weekend is also the main spot where Hatchet is very interesting, but you're not really going to get a lot of value out of Hatchet otherwise. And from this, you kind of have to judge what you want to play it for in terms of your strengths. If I'm a player that's SNS and I like playing in a choke, maybe I'm going to go Warhammer. If I'm a player that's SNS and I like to play more passive, but I throw debuffs at the choke, Hatchet could be a good call. If I am someone who is looking to control people, then prevent people from leaving the choke, IG is great for that on defense, and I think is best in slot. A VG can be really good if you don't have a lot of VGs, but I would generally say that VG is kind of something that has gone from a very, very good build to a generally, uh, I would avoid it. IG provides weirdly similar util because it's able to get ult up so fast, and it has a lot better zone control that I think it makes it outclass VG. You're also able to play further up in the choke with IG because you have the SNS, so inherently that just is a good combo. The main thing that IG lacks is pressure, and if people are able to ignore you, you're not going to get a lot of value, which is where IG really kind of sucks from a offensive, like kind of outside point of view. Because if you're on point and your army's not winning, you're not going to be able to do it with anything with IG to help your army win harder. VG will help you win harder a little bit, and these other hybrid oriented builds are the ones I would consider that if you're trying to carry your army more on the outside, that it's kind of interesting to run. So basically what I'm coming out with this is I think it's for SNS at the moment, there is no single you should run this build all the time. And I think it's a situation where you should be using the actual gear slots that we have now to transfer between builds depending on what phase you are in the game. If you like outside of Fort right now, personally, I like to run Greatsword a lot. Inside of Fort, I like to go to either go VG or IG, depending if I have the gear or not. I mostly have gone to VG because I like to play the anti SNS setup, and VG is just very good at that. IG is just more of a personal, hey, I'm always going to live, I'm going to exist here. I don't personally like to go IG because I don't like to kind of run that very defensive oriented SNS. I like to make plays a little bit more. It's not that Defender's Resolve is worse, it's arguably better in a lot of circumstances. I just find it to be really boring, and I don't like to play that style for a long period of time. I'd rather have some offensive capability. The stagger on Leaping Strike is very underrated, in my opinion, too. And then it's also a good get out of jail free card if you position correctly. So that's where I'm kind of coming at in terms of these rankings, guys. Let me know if that makes sense. Let me know if you have questions or which ones that you're thinking about. If I skipped a weapon on this list that you were considering for SNS, let me know. I basically went down the tree and I did everything that makes sense. Lifestaff actually might be weirdly good next patch because they're going to be buffing some things, and I don't think I'll bring back Paladin, but it's going to be something that people are going to be trolling with in 3v3 and OPR for sure. But yeah, that's what all I have for this for now, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video.